All right, it's time for our last screencast-o-matic flipped classroom activity of the year. You've already received this set of flipped classroom guided notes in class. You always, as in this case, have the option to not do the guided notes, but instead do Cornell notes if it helps you organizationally. Now time to get started. As always, if I'm going too fast, too slow, or if you need to repeat something, you can always pause, rewind, or replay this video as needed. This is going to be a presentation on the Age of Exploration as well as the Atlantic slave trade. So we've already gone over the Renaissance in our last unit and the inventions that came from it, but it's important to keep in mind that those were sequential things. The Renaissance led to inventions which led to the Age of Exploration. Scientific revolution is also known as the Enlightenment period or the Renaissance, and the time period between the 1300s to the mid-1500s when people used experiments and math to understand the natural world. In the scientific revolution, there were a variety of things that changed the way people thought about prospect and different concepts, and those things included curiosity, observation, the scientific method, experimentation, mathematics, scientific instruments, and questioning of ancient beliefs. These are four main people of the scientific revolution or of the Enlightenment and Renaissance period: Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Descartes. But that's just a review. Now what we're going to be talking about is how the Renaissance led into the Age of Exploration. First thing that's important to understand is the idea of mercantilism, which was the idea that starting to compare country to country, a country's government should do everything it can to increase its wealth. How could they do that? Well, there are a few options. One is to take wealth from other countries or to gain new resources. This was measured in gold and silver, much as today you can measure someone's wealth in dollars and cents. Another way for mercantilists to acquire more wealth would be a favorable balance of trade, which means more goods are being sold to foreign countries than your country is buying. So if I'm selling more than I'm buying, I'm going to end up with all the resources I need plus some extra money in my pocket. Another way is tariffs, which were taxes on imports, and they were used to keep imports out. So that's another way to make sure that you are keeping more of the resources and more of the money within your country. Subsidies were also used for business people to start new industries. Subsidies are tax breaks for people who are trying to start new businesses. It was also important to gain control of new overseas resources, like raw materials and precious metals, is what it says at the bottom there. So basically, mercantilism is the idea that your country needs to be the wealthiest country, and the ways to do that are to get more stuff, spend less money, or make sure you're selling the most stuff. Now, why would Europeans want to establish colonies? Well, the government wanted to for a variety of reasons, mostly mercantilism. It provided them with new raw materials, which were used to create things that they could sell, new markets for people to sell to, and extra gold and silver. And the reason people wanted to settle there as colonists were the added adventure, religious freedom, and overpopulation in Europe. So as you can see, there were many reasons for both governments to want to create colonies and for people to settle as colonists. And if it wasn't established already, colonies were areas not within the home country that were owned by the country. So if Spain wanted to create a colony, they might create it in South America, and they would have the opportunity to control that area. Their government was in charge of that area, and all of the money and resources came from that area. Now, we already established why some people wanted to explore, why people wanted to make money, and why people wanted to establish colonies. But how can an explorer get their expedition funded? Well, there were a variety of ways. The first was a bank loan. They could ask for money. I'll pay you back at this time with this amount of interest. The second was a joint stock company, which was to create a company, have other people buy into the company, and you split the profits. The third way, and the most common way, was a monarch. So they would ask the king, hey, king or queen, can you pay for this trip I'm going to take? All the glory goes to your country when I get back. Another reason why the Age of Exploration took off was the search for spices. As you guys remember, one of the main reasons why the art boom took off in the Renaissance is because the trade with Asia led to a lot of money that people spent on art. In addition, a lot of people had this extra money and wanted to buy things like spices. So the Age of Exploration was really pushed through by the idea of looking for the spice islands, mainly Indonesia and Southeast Asia. They also needed a more profitable route to Asia. The previous route that they had was sailing all the way south of Africa, Cape Hope in Africa, and all the way through. So what they wanted to do was look for a route that was not only quicker, possibly faster, but cheaper. That way they could make more money and have a higher rate of total money being taken in by that country. After this set off the age of exploration, Spain and Portugal decided they were going to argue for New World territory, which resulted of the line of demarcation. And that established that Spain would get everything to the west and Portugal to the east. This is also known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. So to look at the line of demarcation and the Treaty of Tordesillas in a little bit more detail, it's important to remember that at this point, the New World was discovered. Everyone realized that, hey, we want extra money, we want extra land, we want extra resources, and we want colonies. Who gets what? Now, as a brief overview of the age of exploration, this guy Columbus was famous for claiming to find India, but we'll explain a little bit more about his contributions. Magellan, among many other contributions, named the Pacific Ocean. Amerigo Vespucci has the distinction of having the whole New World named after him, both North and South America. You get it? Amerigo, America. Yep, I figured you got it. Vasco da Gama made multiple successful trips to India around Cape Hope in the southern part of Africa, and Prince Henry taught many others about currents, wind patterns, climates. He was nicknamed Henry the Navigator, even though while he had many contributions to the age of exploration, he didn't really do a whole lot of exploring himself. Now, to discuss more important stuff, let's go more in depth to this Columbus guy. Columbus was an Italian explorer who was looking for a shorter and, again, therefore more profitable passage to Asia. After searching through many different communities and through asking many monarchs, he was finally granted the opportunity to go and was funded by Spain. Columbus then, after a long trip, ended up in the Caribbean and was therefore the first European to discover the New World. Now, this is a really important thing to keep in mind. He was not the first person in the New World, just the first European. There's a lot of evidence that shows that Chinese explorers, Scandinavian Vikings, and Asiatic native tribes had all discovered it first. But he was very important because in this modern Renaissance time period, he did open up communication, travel, and extra resources between Europe and the New World. That's why he's important, not because he discovered America or North America. That's not exactly what happened. He just discovered it for Europe and therefore opened up the world of resources to Europe. He then returned to Spain with a bunch of animals, plants, and natives, as in human beings, and presented them to Spain. This opened up Europe to new resources and therefore sparked interest in further exploration and, as we discussed, in colonization. The exchange of resources between the New World and the European Old World was also called the Columbian Exchange. And here's a brief map showing the Columbian Exchange. Some of the things that came from the Americas and ended up in Europe, Africa, and Asia included maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, peanuts, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, pineapples, cocoa, tobacco, and medicine. The things that went from the New World to, or the Old World to the New World included wheat, sugar, bananas, rice, grape, dandelions, horses, pigs, cattle, goat, sheep, chickens, smallpox, measles, and typhus. So a lot of animals, a lot of things that caught on as successful crops in the New World, and a bunch of diseases that killed a lot of people. That's the Columbian Exchange in a nutshell. Now, we mentioned this briefly before, but it's important to look again. When Columbus sailed from Spain, he sailed across and into the Caribbean over here. After he sailed back, all of Europe was trying to decide who got what property, who got what stuff. That way they could expand their money, mercantilism, and their colonies. So they went to the Pope, Pope Alexander VI, and he decided on an initial line, which you can see right here, saying Spain gets everything to the west of that, Portugal to the east. And then they argued a bit more, and they decided on the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was the final line right here. One of the most influential decisions ever. Now you can see they had no idea how much stuff was on this side of the treaty line. So while Portugal got this right here, which is now modern-day Brazil, technically, according to the Pope, Spain owned all of this stuff, which is quite a bit. Which is exactly why the one decision of one man led to this whole area speaking Spanish, this whole area speaking Portuguese. And also as a result, all of the resources that went with those areas, including the crops, the new things included in the Columbian Exchange, and the colonies, all were split between Spain and Portugal. Now, as you'll figure out a little bit more as we go, a lot of North America was settled instead by the Dutch, the English, and the French, but South America, where many of these resources were, and therefore why it was a profitable discovery, most of that went to Spain. Now, why did Spain and Portugal want to establish colonies in the New World? We already kind of went over that briefly, but it gave them extra land, which gave them extra resources. It also was a good opportunity to spread their religion and gain prosperity, meaning money. And the way they governed their new colonies were appointing people called viceroys, who were supposed to act on behalf of the Spanish government, who reported back to the Spanish government. Kind of like a governor of a smaller area that reports to a larger government. How did labor develop in the New World? Well, there were peons, which were a poorer class, and African slaves. The social system that developed involved a hierarchy of who was important and who got to do more work or the more difficult work. The high part of the social class were the Spanish-born, and then you have the American-born with Spanish blood. So that first upper level of class is people who came from Spain. The next level were people who came from Spain, had family from Spain, but they were born in the Americas. The next level was mixed race, Native American and European, and the lowest race was considered African and European mixed race. Even below that were the African slaves, but they weren't considered part of the social system since they weren't granted the same rights as human beings. Now, this is a huge topic that we have to cover very quickly, unfortunately. But as a result of Europe settling in the New World and having all of these resources and having all of this land, they needed people to work at that land. So what they did is they eventually ended up leading into the Atlantic slave trade. So you could very well argue that the Atlantic slave trade was a direct result of European colonization, which was a direct result of Columbus discovering, but not really discovering, the New World. This is a really important map that I'd like you to take a moment to pause and review. It shows the British Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire, Dutch Empire, and Portuguese Empire, and how they colonized both parts of coastal Africa, the Indies, and the New World. And keep in mind that this tiny little country right here got to keep all of these resources that they found here, as well as control them in terms of government expansion. And the same goes for all the other countries. The triangular trade was the next step. Triangular trade included things that were traded from the Americas to Europe, from Europe to Africa, and from Africa to the Americas. So in general, in the Americas, they were providing to Europe raw materials, things that were used to create finished goods, things like cotton for clothing, tobacco for smoking, and a variety of other things like indigo for coloring clothing. In Europe, they took all of those raw materials, they created the manufactured goods, and they sold them back to the Americas. Nice deal. They provide you with all the supplies, you create it, and then you get to sell it right back to them. Europe got to also sell some of those things to Africa, and from Africa they got slaves. And those slaves were sold by local tribes or just taken over and sold to the Americas, where they would create more raw materials that they would send to Europe. So it was a long kind of circular cycle. So raw materials, they needed slaves to create raw materials. They got them from Europe because they took them from Africa. So while the Americas provided things to Europe, Europe provided things to the Americas. While Europe provided things to Africa, Africa provided things to Europe, and while the Americas provided things to Africa, Africa provided things to the Americas as well. And the Atlantic slave trade was important, as you can see in this map. It started in the west coast of Africa, and they were sold or captured and sent to the Americas to create these raw materials. Why Africans? Well, they had immunity to old world diseases, meaning they wouldn't die easily. They would stick out in native populations if they escaped, so if they did escape, it would be easy to catch them again, and many of them survived the 3-month journey from Africa to the New World. Some of the end results were disease, starvation, malnutrition, mutiny, and suicide on the part of the slaves. And again, the whole fact that you're not being treated like a human being and you're forced to work against your will with no money. The consequences of this industry were that entire villages were wiped out, many faced a life of torture and abuse in the New World, and it was the introduction of guns from the Renaissance to the African continent. That's the age of exploration and the slave trade in a very small, brief overview. Keep in mind that this is 2 separate topics that could be covered over the course of an entire year, but it's important to keep in mind the causal events. Columbus and the explorers expanded their interests as a result of mercantilism, which had long-lasting effects on the rest of the world. If you need to pause this, rewind, rewatch, you may do so, but that's it for this flipped classroom video.